Let's begin this. This is CVSP 203, I believe. So today we're doing the social contract. I'm going to be focusing primarily on my old friend Jean-Jacques Rousseau, somebody with whom I share a temperament with, as well as a variety of values regarding modernity and material relations. So I will deal a little bit with Locke and Hobbes, put them in context in relation to Rousseau, but focus on the social contract essentially from a critical framework on the social contract from the point of view of Rousseau, who came after, his writing after Hobbes and Locke. So it's fun, it's critical, I do visuals, and I'm animated, so it should all go well. All right, so, okay. So the modern social contract edition in many ways starts with Thomas Hobbes in the late 17th century. Its purpose was to try to conceive of the relationship between state and citizen as a kind of agreement, and the terms that would create a legitimate foundation for political authority, one that people ought and should obey. While Hobbes' notion of the state and its imbalanced empowerment of state over citizen may seem difficult for us to accept today, his logic nevertheless embarrasses our complaints by its abundance in the present world. That is, variations of authoritarianism are in many ways the norm in today's world, not democratic states. Okay, so John Locke's ideas of the state and the ideal of private property to which he entrusts it, on the other hand, in comparison with Hobbes, has seemed to many to be a far more equitable and just balancing of the interests of private and public power. Indeed, Locke's thought is entrenched in the American Constitution and has had a tremendous influence on mainstream thinking that calls itself liberal, in the belief that rights and property of the individual are the sacred trust which calls forth the state, right? While Hobbes' theory of the state initiated the idea that citizens are due some small measure of right in exchange for duty and obedience, Locke moved in a different direction, harshly, critically, of Hobbes, and regarded the primary purpose of power to be the securing of individual liberty, which, from my and perhaps of most readers, even a liberal sympathizer with Locke, privacy or individual liberty is ultimately one version or another of private property holding for Locke. While Hobbes to this day holds special prowess in the field of international relations for his understanding of anarchic systems and state actors, Locke continues to have a special place of preeminence among political theorists who are more concerned with the preservation of personal liberty in the face of the incursions of state authority. Yet another voice stands out that I think outshines both of these thinkers. This is the voice of the young Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and we are reading the early, perhaps more radical Rousseau, the Rousseau of the first and second treatises, not the Rousseau of the social contract. This was a choice we made in designing the 203 to bring this voice in to provide a critical counterweight to the perhaps more traditional or conservative views of Hobbes and Locke in terms of the formation of social contract theory. Rousseau's text that we're talking about today is really critical reflection and not really constructive development of social contract theory. Each of these three authors, Locke, Hobbes, and Rousseau, provided a theory of how humans lived before the advent of society in the state of nature, and our essential human nature behind the mask of civilization. By looking back to our origins, all three authors argue that we could best understand who we really are today and how we ought to live together, that is, politically. The state of nature as a thought experiment was really a mix of many things. One part education from new scientific principles and methods, one part the report of explorers who had traveled to the Americas and other shores beyond Europe, and finally one part ideological battle for the heart of modern social and political Europe, right? The first two influences are fairly straightforward and clear. All three authors supported their theories with naturalistic conceptions of human understanding, language, and psychology. As well, each had access to reports from the colonies and newly discovered regions that describe the technological simplicity of various tribal societies. They took these reports as providing access to the original way humans lived before the development of institutions that form the basis of civilization, such as state, law, education, medicine. So these reports from explorers were used to elaborate and fill out their visions of what the state of nature looked like. Yet, while they shared these sources in common, the conclusions they came to regarding what social and political contract between the ruler and the ruled best suits our human nature are marked by serious disagreement. For Hobbes, our time in the state of nature exposed us to an anxiety and fearfulness that all but imposed a state of war between peoples and individuals. In essence, all had to participate in this war lest they fall behind others who would eventually attack. The only road out of this mess was for all to agree to hand over power to a single ruler against whom the citizen would have little basis for resistance or complaint. For Hobbes, order is always better than chaos, and at any cost. For Hobbes, a one-sided bargain between citizens and their leaders was a necessary evil. We all hand over power to a greater authority who alone holds the monopoly on power and violence, or we remain in a perpetual state of war, one against the other. John Locke took serious issue with this arrangement. He argued that handing over all of our natural liberties to a ruler merely puts us in new jeopardy, where all are now threatened by the unlimited power of one, the Leviathan, the state, rather than the many of the state of nature. Neither did Locke suggest that war was our condition in the state of nature at all. Rather, the absence of judicial authority to resolve disagreements and the messiness of private justice created a degree of chaos that puts what is most sacred at risk. For Locke, that's private property, of course. For Locke, all roads lead to the sacred right of property, and the democratic rice-based political arrangement he set up to resolve the problems of the state of nature takes this interest as its central concern. The golden rule of the social contract for Locke might be said to be, and this is my framing, not Locke's, respect all others' property as you would wish them to respect yours, right? This is a bit of an ironic critical take, right? This isn't Locke's point of view, but if you read Locke from a critical point of view, it's very easy to come to this understanding. Perhaps even a Lockean could make this argument, right? As we will explore below, Rousseau took these authors, Locke and Hobbes, to be falling into a terrible trap. Locke and Hobbes, he argued, cleverly smuggled the prejudices and values of their political and economic times into their theory of our primitive origins. They did this, Rousseau argued, so as to give the impression that the political ideals they defended in the present were best given our origins and our true human nature. In short, in telling us who we really are through the biased myth of an original way of life in a time before civilization, the state of nature, they then, Locke and Hobbes, moved on to argue how we should live in the present and into the future. While, as we shall see, Rousseau's counter-story of our savage ancestors in an ancient prehistory wandering the forest in solitudes is at times unbelievable, his goal is less scientific than poetic. To break down the modern European self-understanding and to show how the civilization and progress, which we take to be the highest expressions of human development, is little more than a history of terror, injustice, and humiliation. That is, Rousseau's project is to expose the moral bankruptcy and misery behind the facade of European power and wealth that Hobbes and Locke ultimately endorsed. Rousseau begins his text by speaking of two kinds of inequality, one physical and one moral. He understands moral inequality as the enjoyment of privileges by some at the expense of others, such as honor, power, or wealth. Those that enjoy social privileges do so because they have some degree of power or wealth that allows them to do so, not because they are in any way better than anyone else. In some cases, like drinking champagne rather than water, this inequality may not seem very important. In other cases, such as having political influence or having access to basic necessities like education, food, shelter, or medicine, it may indeed seem very important. Seeing the degree to which these kinds of important inequalities were widespread and growing in Europe, Rousseau set out to retell the history of present-day inequality in Europe and to ask whether social contract theory in any way addresses these problems or perhaps is part of the problem of inequality. Hobbes and Locke, Rousseau argues, make the principles of reason, ambition, justice, and property part and parcel of human nature, but he thinks they assume too much in doing so. He wonders what led these philosophers to make these claims and whether we should trust them. His answer is short and blunt. Both of these thinkers and others like them, speaking continually, this is a quote from Rousseau, speaking continually of need, avarice, oppression, desires, and pride, have transferred to the state of nature the ideas they acquired in society. modern society. They spoke about savage man, it was civil, modern man they depicted. Rousseau, end quote. Their versions of original human nature, Hobbes and Locke, are thus more a reflection of modern social interests trying to justify their own greed and savagery on Rousseau's terms. The British social contract theorists presented arguments which conceal their true intent, again, Hobbes and Locke, to justify class privilege, status, and the modern market economy. Even their use of religion, despite its explicit moral claim, does no more than to, on Rousseau's terms, command us to believe that since God himself drew men out of the state of nature, they are unequal because he, God, wanted them to be so, end quote. Thus, for Rousseau, these views need to be rejected in order to understand the real roots of human nature, as opposed to its perversions in the world we currently know. We need to think back to the beginning beyond the philosophical and ideological prejudices of the Enlightenment and assumptions of the modern world, and without assuming that God or nature made inequality as it is, right? This exploration after our first nature, Rousseau poetically dedicates to as a hymn, a song in praise of our first ancestors, the criticism of our contemporaries, and the dread of those who have the unhappiness of living after us, right? Global warming certainly brings this into perspective very quickly in terms of the unhappiness of those who may come to live after us. In Rousseau, we can clearly see that our moral glory lives in our past, a certain romantic yearning, a remote past which he takes as a counterexample to the dystopia and devolution which modern injustice implies and imposes. With this, Rousseau has introduced us to his purpose, plan, and presumptions. Clearly has drawn up some drastic conclusions very critically early on. We have thus to see how he backs these claims up with his own version of human nature to contrast with Hobbes and Locke. Rousseau takes it that original humans in a state of nature were exceptionally vulnerable in comparison with other animals, slower and weaker than most, and not as well equipped to survive as most animals. Yet at the same time, early humans adapted to their conditions and developed the necessary skills to survive. Life in the state of nature made the human constitution strong, robust, and children were largely left to fend for themselves on his account. So children were raised to 2 or 3 years old and then sent packing, right? Get a job, essentially. While the first humans were more than capable of defending themselves from other animals, their primary enemies were actually old age and illness. Yet, on Rousseau's account of the state of nature, of our original life in nature, death came without worry and was not mourned. People died then as they lived, with little anxiety or reflection on the state of nature, the state of things, or with concern for the future. In contrast to this calm, this ease, physical, mental, and illnesses of modern living for Rousseau are many. Rousseau's words on modern life, our life, bear recalling. The great inequality in manner of living, the unwholesomeness of the food of the poor, together with excesses of every kind, immoderate transports of every passion, fatigue, mental exhaustion, the innumerable pains and anxieties inseparable from every condition of life. These are two fatal proofs that the greater part of our ills, modern ills, are of our own making, and that we might have avoided them nearly all by adhering to that simple, uniform, and solitary manner of life which nature prescribed. Just for your interest, you might look at Freud's comments in Civilization, Its Discontents, where he argues the contrary. And also important here to point out that inequality is his primary concern. And if he's talking about the modern, certainly critics coming from a Rousseauian point of view or a Marxist historical materialist point of view would say that the postmodern condition that began with the 80s accelerated the inequality and excesses, right? The freneticness, the stressful pace of life, the postmodern condition that we see starting with the 1980s and which many would argue we still live in, right? So for Rousseau, if he was aware of our conditions since the last 30 or 40 years, he would say that things have gotten worse and reached a new plateau of stressed out craziness. Here, Rousseau asks whether the benefit of civilization outweigh the difficulties of our original condition, right? To what extent has all of our industry and effort to overcome the deficits and injustices of nature in civilization been simply replaced by our excesses and ills, which, for Rousseau, may be nothing less than the result of our own departure from nature? Right? What has been lost and what gained, right? Rousseau's conclusion on this question is clear. In following the history of civil society, we should also be telling that of human sickness, right? There is no gain in leaving nature. We ought to go back, although he's going to later recognize that's no longer possible. In fact, civilization and domesticity have had a far more drastic moral consequences than merely physical ones, right? That we sought to eliminate when we departed from nature, right? For Rousseau, as humankind became sociable and a slave, he grows weak, timid, and servile. His effeminate way of life totally innovates his strength and courage, right? There were physical losses in the state of nature, but the moral ones, the spiritual ones, right? The sense of vitality, élan vital, or what he calls amour de soi, the sense of appreciation of life as an end in itself, of vitality, have been lost with the modern condition, with the civil condition. Yet, what brought about our departure from the original condition of human nature? Rousseau asks, why did we leave, right? For Rousseau, in comparison to other animals, which he considers to be merely machines of instincts, humans are different in their capacity of free will and choice, right? This is the beginning of his explanation of how and why. If we're natural creatures, why did we leave the natural state? Well, there's something more than merely natural about us, right? We're not completely described by that term alone. Instinct alone does not direct our actions or our thoughts on his account. Free will liberates us from mechanistic determinism. We are not merely natural machines. We are creatures of spiritual ends, not merely natural material. For Rousseau, physics may be able to explain physics, right, in the Enlightenment, the mechanism of the senses and ideas, but in the power of willing, nothing is to be found out, but acts which are purely spiritual and wholly inexplicable by the laws of mechanism. Science has nothing to say about our spiritual, voluntaristic side. With this spiritualism and reliance upon intuition, Rousseau departs from the main trend of empiricism which underlies the political thought of Hobbes and Locke. For Rousseau, human agency is not reducible to its internal or external causes, and this engenders a certain human dignity. Beyond free will, humans, for Rousseau, also share an inherent drive to self-improvement, and Rousseau called this perfectibility. Unlike animals, this internal evolution of the mind means that humans assimilate knowledge, adapt to their conditions, and benefit from the developments that implies a real change in our nature, our human nature. Rousseau foreshadows the consequences of this substitute for instinct. It would be melancholy, terribly sad, were we forced to admit that perfectibility is the source of all human misfortunes. And clearly we can hear some kind of overlapping between perfectibility and the notion of reason. In short, it may be the case, on Rousseau's account, that substituting the tree of life with that of knowledge, right, with modernity, is in fact part and parcel of the basis of Rousseau's critique of modern society writ large. He sides with the argument that civilization, in the long run, does a much poorer job, does more harm, right, and producing far more, yet also demanding far more than would ever be warranted in nature, right? The troubles of modern life, as we shall see, have their roots in a crisis of the social and economic foundations of modernity that for Rousseau makes modern humans a tyrant both over themselves and over nature, right? Sounds a little bit like Max Weber and the critical theorists of the Frankfurt School, who see reason as essentially human domination over nature, and by extension, instrumental domination of humanity over itself. Right? That behind science is really this goal of domination. Behind his language is a counter-Enlightenment rejection of reason, that reason itself is merely instrumental, and that in the end, its goal is domination. Mastery first of nature and then of humanity itself. Underlying Rousseau's views then is a critique of domination, where the mirror of nature, the state of nature in this case, as used as a blank slate, a tabula rasa, onto which we moderns may look to consider just how morally corrupt we have become, where we claim virtue, weak where we assume strength, and deformed we've become where we celebrate our normalcy and perhaps even celebrate the peak or evolutionary, our state of development as the peak of evolutionary development, historical development. Rousseau's perfectibility and the will to progress seems to have pulled us away from the peace of nature and tragically into the jaws of the cruel and unjust civil state that both Locke and Hobbes are fans of. We continue to assume it is progress, but it's actually a trap on Rousseau's account. We started with limited instincts, compensated by our mental faculties, which only develop slowly with the onset of experience. Rousseau declares in retrospect that the original human beings had no reason or incentive to work their way out of nature, their first home. For Rousseau, there was certainly neither the anxiety and fear that Hobbes read into the state of nature, nor the philosophizing reason and interests of Locke that Locke read into the state of nature. In short, original savages could never have had intellectually gotten to the social contract. In the first place, because all the thinking and rationality that Hobbes and Locke require to achieve the social contract were simply not available to our original ancestors. Thus, humans were not born philosophers with Locke, nor enemies, nor even political animals. In spite of his later work on the social contract, which I distinguish from his earlier work that we're reading today, the young Rousseau that we are talking about insists that the social contract itself has no basis in nature. There's nothing natural about the social contract. Taking issue with Hobbes' view of the state of nature as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, right? Usually it's just the three, nasty, brutish, and short, but I gave you all five, solitary and poor as well. More candy for you. It is not humans nor their actions which make this the case. For Rousseau, at worst, it is the conditions of nature which made life difficult in the original condition. As Rousseau makes the case, slothful, lazy humans in the original state of nature satisfied their hunger at the first oak, slaking their first thirst at the first brook, finding their bed at the foot of the first tree, with all that their wants supplied. Savages were thus not unhappy because, unlike us, they were of sound physical constitution and without anxiety. By contrast, the real misery for Rousseau is with us in our neurotic, crazed, stressful, untrusting existence in the modern world, right? Something we can all certainly relate to on some level. Our whole condition of existence is built up around complaint and fatigue for Rousseau. Thus, where instincts satisfy the demands of the state of nature, reason is never enough in civil society, right? In fact, the glory, honor, and power seeking that Hobbes sees going on in the psyche of the savage, for Rousseau, is nothing but a reflection of our modern inclinations and worldview. For Rousseau, there was neither good nor evil in the state of nature, and even less for an all-out war of all against all, right? Famous in Hobbes, that you'll get to. Oh, that you've already done, actually, the war of all against all. It's kind of cool in the dark. I can tell ghost stories. Actually, Rousseau is telling a ghost story, isn't he? In truth, our unrepressed well-being was the basis of real virtue and happiness in the state of nature. The simplicity, right? Return to nature, return to simplicity. We hear that from our modern-day hippies. This simplicity and sense of vital satisfaction we can hardly conceive of in modern life with its status-seeking, shame, and numberless desires. With this, Hobbes' conservative view of human nature is rejected by Rousseau, who insists, let us not conclude with Hobbes that because man has no idea of goodness, he must be naturally wicked, that he is vicious because he does not know virtue. Hobbes saw the state of nature as a state of war of all against all because he assumed that savage humans are like civil ones, greedy, vain, and cruel. Moreover, Hobbes held that modern greed and violence is a direct reflection of our original nature, only with the addition of law to tame and direct it. But for Rousseau, this is not satisfying. And he argues that Hobbes has merely framed a version of the state of nature to normalize, to justify modern inequality and injustice. Where humans weren't rational in the state of nature, they did not plot against one another, and so did not covet power as Hobbes imagines for Rousseau. They could also do no moral harm to each other because they had no concept of harm, injury, or insult, and were certainly not glory-seeking, right? This concept of honor. More important than this, and a major contribution of Rousseau's psychology, his psychology here, is his position that savages possessed pity and compassion, pitié on Rousseau's French. They sought only their own well-being with the least amount of prejudice towards their fellows. Egoism and the vanity which Hobbes speaks of, where each seeks the highest rank against all others and judges themselves only against others, is a trait of civil, modern, not natural humanity for Rousseau. The insult and injury of contempt which both Hobbes and Locke imagine as a cause of the disorder in the natural state, is not found here. There's no insult and grudge making that we develop, the sense of vanity and sensitivity, vindictiveness, that Hobbes and Locke imagine to be part of our original nature. For Rousseau, that's simply a modern trait. Thus, the potential for violence of revenge that so motivates other social contract theorists does not concern Rousseau. It is the vanity and glory seeking of the members of civil society, we moderns, and our hierarchies of class society which alone create the conditions of war, the permanent condition of war. It is the advancement of the arts and sciences. Actually, this is his second treatise. Rousseau's first treatise was on the arts and sciences. And the faculty of reason which shuts off our inner voice of pity, of compassion, and leads us towards calculus of rational self-interest for Rousseau, that allows Rousseau to declare that, perish if you will, die if you will, I don't care, I am secure. I did a little improvisation there with the I don't care, that was me. Last modern remains of compassion and empathy live on for Rousseau in the suffering working classes, who, unrepressed by a surplus of reason or education, still have access to moral compassion, conscience, and passion. That is not only science, but social class as well for Rousseau, which is responsible for the decadence and regressiveness of modern life. The Enlightenment's progress of the mind and the cruelties of class society go hand in hand with one another. The Enlightenment is not enlightening. It is actually regressive for Rousseau, isn't it? In fact, Rousseau goes as far as to claim that it hasn't been reason that has preserved human society or allowed it to